Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. I thought I'd talk about a strategy I see amateurs do quite a bit, and I think the reason they do it is because they've seen a couple of Grandmaster games where it happens, but they don't quite realize when it works and when it doesn't, when it's appropriate. And I call it kind of the Anti-Fianchetto idea. And both sides in amateur games tend to go a little crazy over this, both in trying to do it and trying to avoid it, when actually doing it is not that good and avoiding it is unnecessary. But let's take a look at what I'm talking about. And what I'm talking about is when one side fianchettos and the other side decides to offer the trade of bishops for the fianchetto. So let's create a mythical game here where we do something like that. So let's say white plays e4 and black plays g6. That's the modern defense. So let's say white says, okay, I see that you want to fianchetto that bishop. I know what the right strategy is. The right strategy is I should put my bishop from c1 up along the diagonal. Then I should put my queen behind it, and then I should play bishop h6. And that will not only neutralize that bishop, but it'll give me like a big attack or something. So let's say white goes ahead and tries to do something like that. Let's say white plays d3. Could have played d4, which is a better move, but we're just showing an idea here. And black fianchettos, and white says, all right, I want to bring out my bishop so I can put a battery with my queen and my bishop, but if I do that, he's going to play bishop takes b2. So first I need to bring out my knight. And now black says, I'll just play d6 in the center. White says, let's get ready to create that battery. Black plays knight f6, getting ready to castle, and white says, there's the battery. Now in this position, black could already play something like knight to g4, but let's say he castles. And let's say now white realizes, uh-oh, knight to g4 could be a problem. Let me play h3. And now let's say black sees that bishop and the queen there, and he says, uh-oh, white has a really big threat here. He's threatening to play bishop h6 and trading off my good bishop there that's fianchettoed, and it'll be pinned to my rook. So the way I can prevent that is to move my rook, so when he plays bishop h6, there's no pin, and therefore I can move the bishop. This kind of faulty logic I see all the time when people are playing fianchetto lines like the dragon and stuff. They do this. So what's happening is both sides are using faulty strategy here. White thinks that it's a panacea to play bishop h6, and black thinks that it's such a panacea that he has to avoid it at all costs. So now black plays the unnecessary move rook e8. If we ask the engine to show us the top 3 or 4 moves here, you can see that none of the moves are to move the rook to e8. In fact, none of the moves try to stop bishop h6 in any way. They just kind of ignore it. We can see the top move here is e5. The second best move is c5. Third best move is d5. Fourth best move is knight c6. They all give black equality. So there's no need to play a move like rook e8, but we're going to do that because we're trying to show you what not to do. So rook to e8. All right. And now white says, well, of course, I have to play bishop h6 because that's the whole idea of this opening. And he does. Let's look at the top moves here. All right, so we can see bishop h6 does make the list, but at 25 ply, Stockfish 14 says that bishop h6 is not only not the best move, but there's other moves that are a little better, and it's not anything special. It's just a move. It's not a terrible mistake, but it's not like, oh, you really have to do that, and if you do that, it's going to be a great move. So we can see in this kind of position, bishop to h6 is not terrible, but it's not required, and it's not a wonderful move that's going to completely refute black's strategy of fianchettoing his bishop, which is what people generally think. So bishop h6, and now you can actually see the engine's top move is to, believe it or not, take that bishop and take off the bishop on h6 to discombobulate the white queen on h6 a little bit. We could show you that line a little bit. Bishop takes, queen takes. Now says black should play something like e5. And it says white should play g4. Let's say white tries to open up the h file with h4. It says now black can kind of ignore him with knight c6. If he plays h5, the engine says ignore that too. Play knight d4, threatening to fork. White plays pawn takes, knight takes check, king d2, knight takes rook. Stockfish says the only move is g7, and it says white's a little bit better here. Complicated line, obviously. All right, let's get back to the game, or let's get back to the main idea, which is after bishop h6, the reason black played rook e8 is so he can play the wonderful move bishop h8. Well, if we look at the top moves here, not only was bishop takes h6 equal number 1, but you can see that bishop to h8 is not in the top 4. And let's see how bad bishop h8 is here. Right now, if black plays perfectly, the engine says the evaluation is about 0.4 for white. If black plays bishop h8, look at that jump up. Now it's not 0.4 anymore. Now white's lead is up to about 0.9. Now it's settling down a little bit to 0.6. But the point is, bishop h8 is not only not a great defense for black, but it's also an unnecessary move. The fact is that when white plays bishop h6, there's no threat to trade the bishops for white. You're trading your best dark square attacker for his best dark square defender, which ends up being a fairly neutral trade, except for the fact that white has taken 1, 2, 3, 4 tempos to do it, which is tempos that black can use for his development. So white's not really threatening bishop takes g7. Now, if white could take off that bishop with a knight, well, that would be different. Then white would have the bishop pair, he'd have a dark square bishop, and black would be weak on the dark squares. But trading the dark squared white bishop on h6 for the dark squared black bishop on g7 is fairly neutral trade. And as we just saw, black could even take the bishop on h6, or he could just ignore it and let white take him. But trying to avoid it with this idea of rook to e8 and then bishop to h8 is just all wrong. And now the engine thinks that white has an advantage of about 1.0 pawns. All right, so you might say, well, I've seen grandmasters do it. When do they do it? They usually do it in in castling opposite sides positions, like the Yugoslav dragon or the Simish attack in the King's Indian, maybe the 150 attack in the Peert's defense. And here white was going to castle queenside, and I did that on purpose, so it wasn't completely ridiculous. When it's on the same side, it's even less likely that this idea is going to be good for white. So let's look at a dragon where black plays it all wrong and bishop h6 works. So I created a mythical game like that over here. All right, let's take a look here. We're going to look at the main line of the Yugoslav dragon, at least for the first 8 or 9 moves. e4, c5, Sicilian defense, knight f3, d6, d4, open Sicilian. Trade the side pawn for the center pawn, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3. Now the most popular move for black by far at the grandmaster level is a6, the Najdorf defense. Black could also play knight c6, the classical, e6, the Skavenigan. But in this case, we're going to play g6, the dragon. Why is it called the dragon? Because these pawns here make the picture of a little dragon with the dragon tail there. Okay, so white plays bishop e3, bishop g7, and now f3 to guard the e-pawn and stop knight to g4. Castles, queen d2, knight c6. So far, so good. Both sides are playing the main tabia moves. And now the main moves for white are castle queenside, bishop to c4. And they used to play h4, but now the engine tells people that g4 is even more accurate. All right, and we're going to play this badly for black on purpose. So just to show when bishop h6 can be really threatening. So let's say white castles queenside. Now the best defense against castles queenside, as you can see from the engine here, is to play d5 and to break up the center. But let's say black plays it as if white had played bishop c4. Let's say he plays bishop d7 and white plays h4. And now black could play like Andy Soltis played against me and play h5 to try to stop h5. And that's the best move here, even though this isn't the exact same position as my game with Grandmaster Soltis from many years ago when Soltis first played h5 in a tournament game. So let's say black just keeps playing like rook c8 and white plays h5 and black takes the pawn and white plays g4. Now black should play knight g3 and hit the rook and the bishop and try to get the bishop pair. Let's say he just goes back. That's a mistake, but again, we're playing this badly for black on purpose. Now bishop h6 doesn't quite work. Black has a tactic with knight e4, so we'll stop that first with king to b1. And now let's say black goes for the old knight e5, knight c4. Well, that's the right way to play when the bishop's gone to c4 and then to b3, but with the bishop on c1, it's awfully slow. So knight to e5, and now white says, oh, I opened that h-file for a reason. Let me see if I can put my queen and my bishop on the h-file, and he plays bishop h6. Notice if you look at the engine, black can still defend this position. With bishop takes h6, and with proper play, he can get equality. But we're going to play it wrong. We're just going to show you how dangerous this can be if black plays it wrong. Black says, I'm going to win the bishop pair with knight to c4. White says, fine, I'll give up my bishop to save that tempo from having to move my queen. Black plays rook takes. And now white plays bishop takes g7. And black's in big trouble. Why? Well, if he takes back, white gets to play queen h6 check. The king moves, it doesn't much matter where. And now that knight on f6 is guarding the h7 square. If we can remove the guard, we can get a mating attack. We could play g5 and make the knight move, but the knight will go to h5 and block the rook. That will not save him, but we don't need to do that. We can just play a move like knight d5, offering to trade off the defender of the mate. And black's in big, big, big trouble. His only move to really stop the mate is to just give up the knight for the pawn right away, and of course he's just losing terribly here. So after knight d5, black can resign. White's threatening knight takes f6, and then queen takes h7 mate. There's no way to really guard that. So the engine says knight h5 is the only move that stops mate for any period of time. So this is the kind of position. If we go back to where white played bishop h6, this is the kind of position where, the kings are on the opposite side, the h-file is open, we can get the queen over to the h-file and create some big threats. This is the kind of position where bishop h6 makes a lot of sense. All right, so now I thought I'd show a game that a student showed me that I went over this morning, where both sides were so kind of afraid of this and kind of making moves that they kind of messed themselves up. So let's take a look at this game that was played. Go back to here, go back to the start of the game. All right, so white opens up with knight f3, can transpose into lots of openings. Black plays d5, white plays g3, he's going for some sort of King's Indian attack. And now black puts his knight in front of his c-pawn. Well, the only reason that'll work is if black can now play e5 and get a nice center. So white should really give up on the normal King's Indian setup here and say, I want to punish black with d4. Why does that punish black? Because black's break move c5 is not readily available here, and his other break move e5 is not safe because white's got two pieces on it and black only has one. And by playing d4, even though that's not the normal move in the King's Indian attack, white can get a nice little advantage in the opening to take advantage of the fact that black put his knight in front of his c-pawn. But white didn't know that, so he plays bishop g2 and black plays e5, and now black's got that big center he wants. This is basically now a reverse Peertz defense. White plays d3, black develops his knight, white castles. Black plays bishop c5. That's not the best move because it allows what's called the center fork trick. Here white can play knight takes e5, and if black plays knight takes e5, white has d4, getting his piece back and breaking up black's nice center. If black instead, after knight takes e5, plays bishop takes f2 check, that doesn't work. We can just take with the rook, and when he takes with the knight, we still broke up black's pawns in the center, and now white has, in addition to everything else, white has the bishop pair and a semi-open file for his rook. Again, this is very good for white. So that's what white should have done. Instead of playing knight takes e5, white plays c3. Take some of these lines off the board here. White plays c3. Black plays e4. White correctly takes that pawn. Now black can't take back with the pawn because if he takes with the pawn, then white will trade queens. And no matter how black takes back, white will play something like knight here, hitting this pawn. And he can really start to pile up on it. For instance, bishop here, White can maybe play knight to d2. The engine says it's better to play b4 or bishop b3 first, but White's okay here. The game's about even. All right, so back to the game. In the game, Black played knight takes e4. And here, White should probably just develop his bishop with knight bd2. I think the engine thinks knight fd2 is slightly better, but you want to get your pieces out. Here, White makes not a very good move. Now, Black's not threatening. Knight takes f2, rook takes f2, bishop takes f2 check, king takes f2. Let's say White does nothing. Let's say he plays knight bd2. And let's say Black does that. Bishop takes, rook takes, knight takes, king takes f2. Look at that advantage for White, 2.6. So before Black did all this, the game was roughly even. And now that Black traded a bishop and a knight for a rook and a pawn, he's dead lost. So you got to watch out for those Reinfeld numbers. A lot of weaker players say, oh, well, this is good for Black. He just traded 6 for 6 and he exposed the white king. But a much better way of looking at it is a bishop and a knight is worth a lot more than a rook and a pawn. And all those tempos that Black spent moving his knight up and trading it off on f2 are completely lost on the board now. Those tempos are completely gone. It's as if Black has only made a couple of moves, and White's getting all his pieces out. So this position is actually pretty much winning for White. So you shouldn't be afraid of that. In the game, White played knight d4. That blocks the diagonal for the bishop, but it moves the knight twice for really no apparent purpose when he should be just getting his pieces out. Black plays knight f6. White plays bishop g5. Probably better here to just take the knight and double his pawns. Bishop g5, not a bad move though. Black says, all right, you're threatening to take... What's White's threatening here? He's threatening to take the knight, and if the queen tries to take, then that would remove the guard on the d5 pawn. Bishop takes d5. So Black trades the knight first so that now he'll be able to bring the bishop back, and the bishop guards the knight, so there's no removal of the guard on the d5 pawn. White plays knight c3. Black plays c6. Take some of these arrows off the board. White plays rook c1. Better would be to play the minority attack here with rook to b1 and then b4 and then maybe a4 and b5. Or White could play f3 and e4 and break in the center. If he's going to break in the center with e4, he wants to recapture with a pawn so he doesn't isolate his d-pawn. White plays rook c1. Black plays h6. White plays bishop d2. And now Black sees the fianchetto here. And he says, oh, if he's fianchettoed, if I can get my queen and my bishop on this diagonal, I can offer this trade, and that will be good for me. So White plays rook e1, getting ready to play e4, but he really doesn't want to play e4 because he won't get any compensation for his isolated d-pawn. Black correctly castles to get his king out of the way, and White moves the bishop again. The reason he didn't play e4 here is because his d-pawn was hanging. If he plays e4 right away and Black takes and he takes back, this pawn is hanging. That explains why he moved the bishop. So he moves the bishop first so that the queen can guard the d-pawn, so that after e4, d takes e4, something takes e4, then queen takes d4 is not possible for Black. Black simply plays queen up to d7, creating that battery to threaten bishop h3. So after the game, I asked White, is Black threatening bishop h3? Now, the word threat in chess means it's good for one side and therefore bad for the other. And he said, yes. And I said, well, he can play it, but it's not a threat because it's not really that good for Black. It's just a move. It doesn't really do that much for either side, so it's not really a threat. So White plays e4, which is not the right idea, as we said, to isolate the pawn, but he didn't realize about this b5 break move or maybe playing f3 first. So he just plays e4 to try to get some play. Pawn takes, knight takes. And now, this is the important part of the game as far as our video is concerned. What should Black do here? Black has a nice isolated pawn to shoot at. Both sides have the same amount of material. So Black is a little better. White's queen isn't developed yet, but Black doesn't develop his rooks yet. If we look at the top moves right here for Black, the number one move is rook on f to d8. That's exactly what you want to do. You want to, those two rooks are doing nothing. You want to take the rooks, start attacking that isolated pawn, maybe put one rook on the open e file and the other rook on the semi-open d file. Things like that. You want to bring the rooks out. So the number one move is rook f d8. The number two move is to blockade the pawn with knight d5, threatening to win the bishop pair with knight takes f4. The number three move is to put the rook on f8 to e8 and put it on the open file. The fourth move is to play knight takes e4. But notice that the idea of our video, which is how do you play against that fianchetto, none of the top four moves is to play bishop to h3. Bishop h3 is completely the wrong idea. And when I was going over the game with my student, and I saw that his opponent played bishop h3, I said, oh, well, Black's letting you off the hook here. He's playing bishop to h3, and instead of attacking your isolated pawn and trying to do things in the center, he's playing against your fianchettoed bishop, but there's no reason to play bishop h3. It's not that it's a horrible move, it's just that strategically it doesn't do very much. So Black plays bishop to h3. Let's again take off the lines here. Black plays bishop h3. Well, is Black threatening to take the bishop on g2? Well, it's a legal possibility on the next move, but just because it's legal on the next move doesn't make it a threat. It means it has to do something good for Black. And the answer is no, he's not. In fact, if we look at White's number one move here with the engine, it's actually to take that bishop on h3. The number two move is to play knight takes f6 check, followed by bishop takes h3. So actually, the engine wants White to take that bishop on h3 and force the queen to come up. Let's take a look at that number one line here. Bishop takes h3, queen takes h6. Now, a lot of people properly would be worried about this move knight to g5 with the idea of threatening mate, so White has to do something about it. Well, what does he do about it? Easy. He can trade the knights. And now the engine suggests, while there's no other pieces on here, he can get rid of his isolated pawn. If Black takes it, White can take with the queen. And if Black pins it, then maybe White can just push it up and get instead of being a weak isolated pawn, it becomes an isolated passed pawn, which is good and bad. And now basically White has equality here, and there's no mating attack with the queen here on h3. So this is a good line to study. Now, suppose White doesn't do that. Suppose he plays some innocuous move here. Suppose White plays, let's say he develops the queen. Let's say he plays, we got to guard this pawn over here. So let's say he plays queen to d2. All right, well, Stockfish says that doesn't quite work for some tactics. So we guess we got to come up with a better move. Queen to a4 maybe? Let's try queen a4. Queen a4. All right, queen a4. Engine says in these kind of... Now, why does Black want to trade the bishops here? It's not that he wants to trade the bishops because the white bishop is so strong. It's because his queen is overworked. His queen wants to attack this pawn, but he can't guard the bishop and attack the pawn at the same time, so that's why he wants to trade the bishop here. But the best moves for White, as we said, are not moves that avoid the trade of bishops. It's actually the best moves are for him to initiate the trade of bishops. Let's look at what happens in the evaluation when White tries to avoid the trade of bishops. Right now, the evaluation is 0-0 if White plays the best lines. What are the only moves that avoid the trade of bishops? Well, we can play bishop to f3. Look what happens to the evaluation when we avoid the trade of bishops. It jumps from 0-0 down to minus 1.0 roughly. So White has lost the whole pawn. Why is that such a bad move? Well, because there was no threat and you wasted a whole tempo basically doing nothing just to put your bishop on a square where only the queen's guarding it. And even worse is the move played in the game. My student was so afraid of his bishop getting traded off here. He said, thank goodness my rook is out of the way, just like we looked at earlier in the video. And my student plays the ugly move, bishop to h1. Well, all right, last time we saw if he played bishop f3 that the Black would be up by about one pawn, and after bishop h1 he's also up by about, Black's now up by about a pawn. Both moves, bishop f3 and bishop h1, are basically just complete waste of tempo. I don't like bishop h1 even more because on g2 the bishop had four directions it could go, up to the left, down to the left, up to the right, down to the right. And on h1, he only has one direction, up to the left, that he can go. So he's lost 3 out of his 4 directions. Now, what does he gain by playing bishop h1? Well, what he gained is to avoid that bishop trade. But we've already seen that that bishop trade was not really a threat. In fact, bishop takes h3 was like the best move. So by avoiding that bishop trade and losing the tempo, White's doing sort of what we saw in that first example earlier in the video, where he tried to do that. And that triggered me to say, you know, I see this all the time from my students, that they think that playing queen d7 and then bishop h3 is the panacea to play against the fianchetto. And when White sees that, he gets so upset that he plays moves like bishop h1. And I said, you know, I've seen this enough that I really should make a video about this so I can talk to everybody there at once and say, all right, there's times when putting your queen and your bishop like that on the diagonal and then offering the trade of the fianchetto bishop is really good. There's times where it's really a waste of time. There's times when it's kind of neutral, like, yeah, it's okay, but there's other things you can do. So sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's in between. But it's not a panacea like every time someone fianchettos, this is what you have to do. And from the person who's fianchetto's point of view, you don't have to try to stop it. Sometimes if it's a big threat, you can. Or if he plays bishop h and he moves his bishop to h6 or h3, you know, sometimes you can avoid the trade advantageously. But most of the time, it's just a neutral trade between the 2 bishops of the same color squares, either the light color squares or the dark color squares. And it's fairly neutral, and wasting time trying to twist yourself into a pretzel a little bit like this, trying to avoid it, is just not the right idea. Again, these things are very gray. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. But what we don't want people to think is every time someone fianchettos, let's put my queen and my bishop in a battery and offer the trade of queens. And we don't want the people fianchettoing to think every time someone does that, we have to twist ourselves into a pretzel, avoiding that trade of the bishop, or else his threat will be carried out and I'll have a bad game. Because neither of those things are true, and yet I see them all the time. How did I learn these things? I learned them by playing over lots and lots and lots of annotated master games, and you saw that grandmasters almost never played this kind of idea. Did I ever see a grandmaster do something like this? Maybe once or twice out of, a million fianchetto games. Yeah, I mean, you can never say never, but rarely was a move like bishop h1 the correct move. And again, I can't say never, but rarely was that the right move. And not only did I play over those annotated master games, and you can too. I used to play an average of maybe, first 3 years I was playing in tournaments, I averaged maybe going over 2 annotated master games a day. Maybe I didn't do it every day, but maybe on the weekend I caught up. But that's what you can do, and you can analyze games with your opponents, go over games with good players. Good players are going to look at this and say, why did you play bishop h1? That doesn't make a lot of sense. And when you talk to good players, you're going to learn things like this. And that's the purpose of today's video, is when someone fianchettos, okay, there's things you can do against it. If you could trade it off that fianchettoed bishop for something other than your bishop of that same color, if you could trade it off for a knight, that's usually pretty good for you. For instance, let's go back to the start of this game. Let's just make some silly moves here. Let's say that you fianchetto your bishop and black puts a knight there, and you move your knight back and he castles. For instance here, not in a million years would white play bishop takes c6. Not only does that give black the bishop pair worth about a half a pawn, but it also weakens the light squares around the white king, and black would have a light squared bishop and a queen, and white wouldn't have a light squared bishop. So right now the engine says that if black plays d4, he's got a slight disadvantage. That's his best move. Let's see how much he loses by playing bishop takes c6. Wow, look at that. After b takes c6, if you say, wow, I doubled his pawns, the answer is, yeah, that's very nice, but as I said in an earlier video, double pawns aren't always that bad. And here, White's disadvantage went from being microscopic all the way up to minus 1.1. So he lost about equivalent of an entire pawn by playing that terrible move. So sure, if you're black and you can get him to do something like this, then that's good. But trading off his light squared bishop for your light squared bishop is not the same thing. All right, hopefully today's video was helpful. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, you can. But more importantly, you can tell your friends about the channel Dan Heisman Chess. Pass the word, please. Thanks a lot. See you next time.